It's really an honor to be here. So I'm going to talk about educational prosperity, a life course approach. And it's really a framework for assessment, thinking about what things we should be monitoring in a school, well, not just in a school system, but in a country per se, right from conception through to adolescence. So this is an old slide. This might be 20 years old. It's been my North Star, saying how can we improve children's cognitive, behavioral, and health outcomes while reducing inequalities associated with family background. So you'll see both the variety of outcomes there and also this notion of equality and equity. So I became fairly well known in the PISA world for developing my graphs called socioeconomic gradients. These are gradients for the United States, and I'll just give you a quick rundown. These are PISA reading scores, Program of International Student Assessment. It's an assessment that's conducted every 3 years by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris for all OECD countries, the more wealthy countries in the world. And a standard deviation of 100. So those of you graduate students are fresh on your stats. About 2/3 of everyone are between 400 and 600, and 95% of everyone between 300 and 700. And if you look at the United States, each one of these dots is one of the students in the United States that did the PISA study. And on the x-axis, I have a measure of socioeconomic status, and it's scaled to have an average of 0, standard deviation of 1. Same rules apply. 2/3 of everyone, 95% of everyone. So there's a few things I want you to notice here. First of all, there's a gradient there, as you'd expect. Kids from higher social class backgrounds do better than kids from poor backgrounds. Nominally, you can think of -1 as being everything to the left of that as children living in poverty, although this is not really a poverty measure, but you see you've got a lot of kids in the United States living in poverty. But we think of level 2, these are kids who did not learn to read well during those first few years of school, in most cases. And you'll see how that works as I go along. These are kids who have very low reading skills. So in the United States, you've got about 35% of kids that fall level 2 and lower. And one thing that's always important to note is that vulnerability stretches right across the social class spectrum. There are disproportionately more kids over here from poor backgrounds, but there's lots of kids over on the right-hand side as well. We always focus on schools. You can talk to any family who's got 3 or 4 kids, and they'll say, yeah, I got 2 that are really doing well, and I got 1 that didn't learn to read well. So this is the gradient, the socioeconomic gradient, the best fitting regression line through these data. And you'll see that if you look at scores in 2000, 2003, 2009, things stayed pretty much the same. There's a tolerable equilibrium, or someone might call it an intolerable equilibrium, that these equilibriums, these gradients get fixed for a society. And then, one political party comes along, they say, well, we're going to boost the scores of kids from poor backgrounds. But there's huge social, political, and economic forces that brings it back to this state of stability. So it's a very, very difficult to move gradients. So here's a graph showing the percentage of youth at age 15 who were vulnerable in the sense that they didn't get to level 3 or higher. And that's plotted against GDP. There you see United States out there, 38% or so of kids who are vulnerable. As soon as you get down below a GDP of 15,000, then vulnerability goes up quite substantially. We've been using GNI now, gross national income instead. The term middle income countries are countries with a GNI, gross national income per person of less than 12,000, a little bit over 12,000. And then low-income countries are countries with 4,000 and lower. And I'm just doing some work with the Mexican data and looking at the variation among states. And even though Mexico is now considered a high-income country with a GNI of 16,000, when you look at the variation among states, you've got a lot of states that are middle income and maybe a couple of even low-income states. And I think that's true. I know in Canada, if you look at our First Nations population, our Indigenous population, their GNI would be extremely low. And I'm sure you've got areas even in this city where you would probably have very low. So GNI. My mission is a simple one. We're trying to develop tools and ways of doing business where we can reduce vulnerability by 5%. So if you're at 38%, could we get the US down to 33%? That would be thousands of kids when you think about millions of kids. Here's kind of the way things work right now with our assessment systems. We have studies like the PISA study that measure academic achievement. And you also have your state scores, you've got your NAEP scores, you've got all kinds of various scores. And they rank order schools, and they put a lot of pressure on schools to do better. And the problem is, though, the schools have some models, and we spent years, I'm guilty in this domain, of looking at school effects and say, what are the factors that make a difference? And so we can say, this school's up here, and this one's down here. Well, why is that? And you can say, well, it's quality teaching. That's by far one of the most important variables. But it's also things like pre-service training, having computers, classroom disciplinary climate has always been one of my favorite factors. So we've got a whole host of factors here, and the poor principal doesn't know what to focus on. We have good surveys that can measure all these.